On to part 3, some elementary logic. In particular, what is an argument, and what does it mean to say that an argument is either valid or sound? An argument, for our purposes, is not a row or a dispute. It doesn't involve throwing plates or shouting. Instead, it's a much more placid thing. It's a list of sentences or statements. Never mind about the difference between sentences and statements. I can write that list. P1 through Pn, with sentence C being the last one. The P1 through Pn, the Pi, are the premises, and C is the conclusion. There are two concepts you need to master: validity and soundness, which you will find explained in the brief guide to logic and argumentation. Here's our argument, P1 to Pn, C. A valid argument is one in which it is impossible that the premises are all true, that P1 to Pn are all true, and C is false. Equivalently, this is saying the same thing but in different words, necessarily, or it must be the case that if the premises are all true, then the conclusion is true. Necessarily, if P1, P2, ... Pn are true, then C is true. You should satisfy yourself that these really are two different ways of saying the same thing. It's impossible that the premises are true and the conclusion is false is equivalent to necessarily, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. An argument that is not valid is invalid. A sound argument is simply a valid argument with true premises. And you can see by the definition of validity, a sound argument has a true conclusion. There are no sound arguments with false conclusions. An argument that is not sound is unsound. Let's try that out with a few examples. Here's one argument. Socrates is a Martian. That's the first premise. The second premise is, if Socrates is a Martian, Plato is from Venus. And the conclusion is, Plato is from Venus. I should tell you something about these characters. The Greek philosopher Socrates went on trial in 399 BC on charges of corrupting the youth and refusing to recognize the state's gods. He died very famously by drinking a cup of hemlock, a poisonous plant. Plato was his student. Socrates left no texts, but he does appear in many of Plato's dialogues. So, Socrates is not a Martian. The first premise is false, and so the argument is not sound. It is unsound. It is, however, valid. It is just not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. I think you can just readily convince yourself of that. The argument is of the form premise 1, X, premise 2, if X then Y, conclusion Y. And that argument form is called modus ponens. So that argument is valid and unsound. How about this one? Premise 1, Aristotle is not a Martian. Conclusion, Aristotle is not a Martian. Aristotle is not a Martian. He was a student of Plato and influenced Jewish, Islamic, and Christian theology, and was just an amazing all-round polymath. So the conclusion and the premise are both true. It's clearly not possible for the premise to be true and the conclusion false, because the premise just is the conclusion, and so that argument is both valid and sound. And that teaches you something straight away, namely that a valid, sound argument is not necessarily a persuasive one. It's not necessarily an argument you can use to persuade someone of the truth of a conclusion. Someone who didn't know that Aristotle was not a Martian would not be persuaded by that argument. Here's another one. Premise 1, Democritus is from Venus. Premise 2, Democritus is not from Venus. Conclusion, Aristotle is a Martian. Democritus was an ancient Greek philosopher who was one of the first to propose an atomic theory of matter. The second premise, then, is true, and so the first premise is false. Not that that really matters. The crucial point is that both premises can't be true together, because that would mean that a contradiction was true, and no contradiction can be true, at least in classical logic, which is the logic that we'll be using in this class. Also, the conclusion is false. Aristotle is not a Martian. So this looks like a terrible argument, but it is, if you think about it, valid. It's valid because it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, simply because it's not possible that the premises are true. So the argument is valid. Fortunately, it doesn't have another good-making feature of arguments. It's not sound, because all the premises are not true. So it's valid, yet unsound. Here's a slightly more complicated example. This one and the next are from Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland. He had a day job as a mathematician. He had a keen interest in logic. So the premises of this whimsical argument are: no professors are ignorant, all ignorant people are vain. Conclusion, no professors are vain. It's helpful with arguments of this sort to draw a little diagram. So here are the ignoramuses on the right and the non-ignoramuses on the left. So the first premise tells us that the professors should go there. That's where the profs are. No professors are ignorant. Now, can we fill in the diagram to make the second premise true, that is, to make it true that all ignorant people are vain, and yet make the conclusion false? If we can, then there's a situation in which no professors are ignorant, all ignorant people are vain, and yet it's not true that no professors are vain. Some professors are vain. And we can. This is a way of filling it in. These are the vain people inside that dotted red rectangle. That makes it true that all ignorant people are vain. The ignoramuses are a subset of the vain people. But you can see from the diagram that some professors are vain. So it's not true that no professors are vain. So that's a situation in which the premises are true and the conclusion false, so the argument is invalid. Here's another one, equally whimsical. All lions are fierce. Some lions do not drink coffee. Conclusion, some creatures that drink coffee are not fierce. Let's draw a diagram again. Here are the fierce things on the left. So the non-fierce things are over on the right. All the lions, then, have got to be on the left. That's where the lions are. So that's a situation in which the first premise is true. What about the second premise? Some lions do not drink coffee. Can we fill in this diagram so it's true that some lions do not drink coffee? Some lions are among the coffee abstainers, But it's not true that some creatures that drink coffee are not fierce. Yes, we can. So here are the coffee abstainers. You can see that this is a situation in which some lions do not drink coffee, and yet some creatures that drink coffee are not fierce is false. It's not true that some creatures that drink coffee are not fierce. All the coffee drinkers are to the left of that dotted red rectangle, and they're all fierce. So every creature that drinks coffee is fierce. So the argument is not valid, hence it is invalid. Now would be an excellent time to pause this video and go and do the quiz on arguments. Here's your to-do list for the next week. First, think about how you'd respond to the ontological argument for the Friday recitation. Read the guide to logic and argumentation in the book. Also, for Monday, read the selections by Paley and White. And Roger White, my colleague here at MIT, will be the first subject for those little videos that I talked about in the first lecture. So expect a video chat with Roger next week sometime, probably at the end. We have a great week coming up, so I will see you then. Oh, it sometimes doesn't work. Let me try again. There we go. See you next week.